Okay, Agile is a disease, but so is humanity, ushering in the Taylorism of tomorrow for fun and profit. I feel like this talk needs a little bit of intro. I originally submitted it to the Pittsburgh Tech Conference, Pittsburgh Tech Fest in 2019. And the idea was actually, I submitted two talks. One was on Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein, and I was worried that that one wasn't going to make it, so I submitted this outrageous talk, not in the hopes of actually giving it, but in the hopes of it acting as kind of a foil for my other talk, for my more conservative talk. So if I'm willing to dive into stuff like this, maybe they would understand a little bit more about what I can bring, but also then just allow me to give the more conservative talk. Well, they defied my expectations and ended up asking me to give this one. And so I had an interesting task ahead of me. I had to approach this pretty responsibly because I'm really not one to do this kind of methodology warfare kind of thing. And if anything, what I really wanted to title this talk was Methodology is Hard. So here's some stuff that might make it a little bit better. So if you're seeing this, you probably already know who I am, but I run a company called Hired Thought, and I really try to think of my work as helping people with finding clarity. A lot of people are dealing with a lot of chaos or just too much work, and they're overwhelmed and they need help figuring out how to make sense of it all and take the next step. And so that's how I think about what I do. And so I also give workshops around Wordly mapping because I think that helps people be more intentional in their work and to also just build the skills of thinking about strategy and intention in the workplace. I also work for a boutique consultancy called Praxis Flow, and we do sort of enterprise service orchestration, helping enable enterprise agility, flow enablement, that kind of thing. And the story of my career is kind of this long arc from focusing on technical sides of things, sort of technical problem solving. I used to be a systems administrator, and over time I found that my ability to really achieve what I needed to achieve inside the organizations I was working for was actually limited more by the social side, my understanding of how to work through the human systems, than it was by on the technical side. And so I over time found myself getting more and more into the human side of things, and really that's where I found myself most comfortable and most at home. So I love helping people, and that's kind of why I do that sort of stuff. So Agile is a disease. I won't bury the lead here. Agile is a disease if and only if it's unscoped, it's a switch flip, and if it's inauthentic. And here's what I mean by that. If it's unscoped, it means that it's being applied universally. There's no contextualization to it. If it's a switch flip, it means there's no transition. It's just you wake up one morning and now we are Agile, and somehow that's supposed to work. And it's inauthentic if it's basically not taking a look at the principles of the methodology and applying them for your own context, adapting them along the way, and sort of translating them into your context. So if it's inauthentic, if it's just a naive kind of approach where you just adopt things without adapting them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Taylorism, I'm going to talk about Agile, and then finally we'll get into contextualizing methodology with Wordly mapping. So 1870 to roughly 1914 was the second industrial revolution. You have a lot of growth in business, a lot of unregulated industry, and technological advances that made machines and technology more prevalent in the workplace. And the result was that in a lot of cases, high-skill work was being replaced by machines so that you could hire low-skilled people, unskilled people, or semi-skilled people to run machines and do the same quality of output. And combined with an influx of immigration and also our willingness to pay immigrants and women and children much less than sort of your average men, we found ourselves in a situation where there was an abundance of cheap labor, and this created the context for this unrest and kind of almost outright warfare between the employed and the employers. So the state of the art for management in this context was just basically payroll management. Managers focused on who was hired, how much they were paid, who was fired, etc. And they really didn't have any major involvement in the work itself. And so they mostly managed incentives. In order to secure your initiative, I'm going to give you some incentive in the form of rapid promotion or advancement, some sort of higher wages or premium, some sort of premium or bonus program, shorter hours, better working conditions, etc. It's kind of surprising how little has changed in some respects, but I thought that was kind of interesting. So moving on, there was a problem with this status quo of management. And if you've ever worked in a group project in high school, or college is notorious for this, you get together with a bunch of people for a very short project. And what usually plays out is as you're getting to know each other, as you're sort of figuring out what it's like to work together, inevitably one person does absolutely nothing. And most of the group does enough to get by, but one person does most of the work. And so imagine if that happened every day that you went to work. Every day you show up, you work with those around you, and a couple people loaf, a couple people sort of do enough to get by, and you're trying to put in that extra amount of effort. At some point you're going to say, this is bullshit. Why should I be doing this? Why should things be this way? This phenomena was prevalent in this time period and was called soldiering. It was basically the artificial limitation of productivity. Basically do as little as possible without getting in trouble with management. And it was the natural outcome of everybody being paid the same, but some people loafing and some people not putting in as much work. So why should I work that hard when that lazy person over there gets the same pay as I do and only does half as much of the work? So this is one major issue with this sort of state of management. Another is that the work itself was highly divergent. If I was shoveling coal and someone else was with me shoveling coal, guaranteed we're using two different methods for shoveling coal. If we're bricklaying, it's the same kind of story. Everybody who's learned how to do this work has learned from somebody else. And while there are many positives from the refinement over generations of how to do this kind of work, everybody learns something different. And so the weaknesses are different, but also so are the strengths. And so there's no uniformity to the work. And this is causing vast inefficiency. And so in this situation, Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is no stranger to the factory floor, he started out as a machinist, kind of worked his way up the ladder, equal parts skill and hard work and nepotism. And in his mind, this situation was just absolutely undesirable. Managers are only managing payroll. There's lost output due to soldiering, and there's lost output due to inefficient, unstandardized methods. And so in his view, the system of management was defective. And so he wrote The Principles of Scientific Management, which essentially espouses his theory of maximum prosperity for the employer coupled with maximum prosperity for the employee, that being the object of management. That's why management should exist. And in his view, in the past, the individual has been first, but in the future, the system should be first. And if you are building good systems, you are developing first-class people. So he looked at management and said, you need to take more responsibility for the results of the work. And what you need to do is to develop the science of the work and then teach it. Figure out the best way to do the work and then teach it to the people who are working for you. And so I like these two quotes because they really illustrate what that means. Almost every act of the worker should be preceded by one or more preparatory acts of the management to enable better and quicker work. And each worker should daily be taught by and receive the most friendly help from management, neither driven or coerced, nor left to their own unaided devices. And so he viewed this as management taking responsibility for enabling better and quicker work, and also taking a better handle on the continuum of sort of leaving people to their own devices doing their own thing versus not overwhelmingly micromanaging them. So finding that sort of middle ground. In this context, with the gang work, where people working on teams and just kind of doing things their own way, it had sort of shifted more towards that leaving people to their own unaided devices, and so he felt there was a need to sort of restore the balance. So how do you develop the science of the work? In Taylor's mind, first you select a first-class worker, someone who is capable and fully able to do the best version of the work. If it's shoveling coal, if it's lifting pig iron, if it's laying bricks, whatever it happens to be, and then pay them extra wages to essentially get more trustworthy work, to remove or at least suspend the systemic soldiering that was taking place there. So you'd have a conversation where say, do you want to do high class work? I'll give you some extra wages, and we're going to work together to figure out what the best way to do this work is. So you run experiments around the work itself and around the implements that the person uses. So for instance, if you're shoveling coal, how many steps should you take from the coal pile? How should you move with your arms or with your back or with your legs in order to shovel coal in the most effective and efficient way? And at the same time, what implements should you use? If you're shoveling coal, everybody every day is bringing their own shovel into work. And it turns out not all shovels are built the same. And so if you as the manager determine that the optimal sort of load for a shovel worth of coal is 21 pounds, then what you should do is standardize on implements that support that kind of load. And so if someone brings a shovel into work that can only pick up 10 pounds, then maybe you should be issuing shovels, standard implements that are able to do the optimum version of the work. And in addition to that, you're training the workers one by one. So picking people out and saying, would you like to be paid more to do max sort of high class work? And then if so, we're gonna build you the skills, we're gonna pay you more, but we're gonna help you every day until you understand how to execute this work. And then on top of that, you got frequent individualized performance feedback. Every day you'd come in and you'd open your sort of bin and you'd see whether or not you made your quotient of whatever work it was you were supposed to be doing. And if you didn't meet that quotient, then what you would have to do is work with a manager to figure out what was wrong and sort of restore things to a state where you understood, restore things to a point where you were actually doing the work correctly. So if you've heard of Taylorism, you've probably heard of the idea of the stopwatch, and this conjures up all sorts of awful feelings and awful thoughts of a manager following you around with a stopwatch, timing every movement. If you write software, how long does it take you to write a function or a unit test or something like that? If you do other work, how long does it take you to do that with a manager just watching closely? And there's this kind of like super evaluative frame, judgmental, micromanaging frame that I think often comes up. But really, the use of the stopwatch was the result of an agreement. Look, do you want to do high-class work? If so, we're going to increase your wages by 30%, and you're going to work with us one-on-one to learn how to do the work. And so the stopwatch was not, it was evaluating, but it was actually primarily about instructing. So how long should it take you to pick up this piece of this shovel load of coal and move to this pile? What is the sustainable pace? When should you be taking breaks? And essentially, sustainability was a big part of this because they didn't want you to tire out and lose your ability to perform the same way the next day. And so managers were trainers teaching people how to do this work, not just sort of evaluating whether you made it or not. So the results of the system when Taylor wrote the Principles of Scientific Management was that you had 50,000 people in the US employed under the system. You had people being paid 30 to 100% higher wages. Output had doubled, and really the relationships between management and workers were pretty okay. Rather than outright warfare as it was before, there hadn't been a single strike. Things were generally about friendly cooperation, really pursuing that common goal of prosperity for both the company and the employee. So I have a friend of mine, Anthony Mastrian, who every time we talk about methodology and people talking about what something is, he always asks this question: how do I get one? How do I get an Agile? How do I get a Taylorism? And so Taylor wrote a little bit about what it's like to implement scientific management. And he starts to draw this difference out between what is the broad principles of the methodology versus the actual application of those principles. And so in the publications that he's pointing at, when people are talking about implementing scientific management, he's saying things like, most of the readers of these papers have mistaken the mechanism for implementing that stuff from the true essence of the methodology itself. For this talk, I also read a paper by Dr. Eliyahu M. Goldratt about lean and what it's like to implement lean. And this paper really dives into the sort of difference between the application of a methodology and the fundamental concepts on which the application should be based. And he really drills home that the translation for a local context is not a trivial process. We should not expect an application to work in environments for which its assumptions are not valid. So going back to Taylor, he also sort of views this as something that has to happen over a long period of time. When you're changing the workforce one employee at a time, It's going to take a long time to make that happen. And there's a mental attitude that has to shift. And so he looks at an implementation of scientific management as taking 2 to 3 years, and in some cases 4 to 5 years. Moving back to Lean and Dr. Goldratt's paper, so even when an appropriate environment is chosen and you have the best experts helping with the implementation, it takes a minimum of 6 to 9 months per production line. And that's with stable assumptions, right? That the processes and products are stable, the demand is stable, the resource load is stable, and that management is actually focused on improving flow, not focused on cost savings. And if any one of those things isn't true, then this whole idea of what it takes to implement Lean changes significantly. Like if you're releasing a product every 6 months and you're retiring a product every 6 months, that's an interesting situation to be in, right? How could an implementation time of 6 to 9 months survive or work in that context? So these questions make me wonder a little bit about Agile. So how does one implement Agile? How long should it take? Is it something that needs to take years, really, to effectively be implemented? And what assumptions must be valid for Agile to work? What is Agile even in the first place? I tweeted out before I originally gave this talk, was like, in which the author Googles, what is Agile? That's an appropriate transition, because now we can move on from Taylorism and start talking a little bit about Agile. So the Agile Manifesto is an important thing to know if you are thinking about Agile methodologies. When I originally gave this talk, there were about 45 people in the room, and I asked everyone to raise their hand if they believed they were applying Agile methodologies in the workplace, and about 90% of the people raised their hand. When I asked them if they had also read the Agile Manifesto at some point, that number dropped down to about 10 people in the room. And so I think it's really important that people who think about Agile and are thinking about applying that in their workplace or have already done that, I think it's important they understand the foundational principles behind it that originated the ideas, so that they can tell the difference between how they've implemented it in their organization and how the principles themselves were originally idealized. And so I read the Agile Manifesto in front of these folks because I thought it was that important, and not to just beat them over the head with it, but to really ask this question. So when we look at the principles behind it, does this sound like your Agile? So our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Does this sound like your Agile? Do you welcome changing requirements even late in development? Do your Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage? Does that sound like your Agile? And we can go through every single principle like this, all 12 of them. Do you deliver software frequently? Do your business people and developers work together daily? Do you build projects around motivated individuals and give them the environment and support they need? Do you trust them to get the job done? Does that sound like your Agile? Is the most efficient and effective method of conveying information face-to-face conversation? Is your measure of work in progress working software? Do your processes promote sustainability? Can you maintain this pace? I'm thinking back to Taylor and how the best practice for shoveling coal or laying bricks had to be sustainable. It had to have brakes built in. It had to help people make sure that they didn't burn themselves out while doing the work. Does your Agile look like continuous attention to technical excellence and good design? Does your Agile look like simplicity and maximizing the amount of work not done? Do your architecture's requirements and design emerge from self-organizing teams? And do you, on regular intervals, reflect on what's happened and tune and adjust the behavior that you're engendering in the organization accordingly? And so I think it's really important to look at this and then notice the words that you didn't see. You didn't see Scrum, you didn't see Kanban, you didn't see Sprint even, right? You only saw foundational principles. These things, Scrum, Kanban, Sprints, whatever, they're applications, they're translations of the principles for some local context. So my question is, what else is in your Agile? And did you put it there on purpose? Did you adapt it? And do you want it there now? These are things that you're going to have to confront if you're doing Agile methodologies. And so I saw this tweet the other day by Elizabeth Iyer, and it just spoke to me. And when I originally gave the talk, I had lifted both hands and said, be the Agile bullshit sniffer dogs you want to see in the world. I think this really speaks to this problem. Okay, so we've got through Taylorism, we got through some Agile, and now let's talk about contextualizing methodology. This is where we talk about evolution, right? By Simon Wardley, right? So Simon says, when we think about the capabilities we're building in our organizations and in the larger markets, everything starts out with the characteristics on the left. It's chaotic, it's uncertain, it's unpredictable, it's future potential competitive advantage. It's failing a lot. And over time, through supply and demand competition, if it doesn't die out, it continues to evolve towards the characteristics on the right, where it's ordered, known, measured, stable. It's no longer a competitive advantage. It's a cost of doing business. And it's not failing anymore. It's understood. It's running well. And we can also break these capabilities down into 4 categories: activities, what we do; practices, which is how we do them; data, which is how we measure them; and knowledge is how we understand them. And those characteristics can be broken down into 4 stages as far as the transition goes from left to right. And I want to focus in on practices and knowledge to have a good discussion about methodology. So practices shift from novel to emerging to good to best. Knowledge shifts from concept to hypothesis to theory to accepted. And when we think about methodology and we think about where things are appropriate to be, Agile is super strong in this early stage part where things are uncertain and unknown, in the novel concept and emerging hypothesis stage, and is super weak in the good theory or best accepted stages. So when we think about what Agile is good at, what is it good at? It's great at reducing the cost of change. And so things that are in stage 1 and 2, we could build in-house with Agile methods because you can't get them anywhere else. Now, on the other hand, things that are in stage 3 and 4, these tend to look a little bit differently, and it tends to be that Six Sigma is a better match for it because it's about a focus on reducing deviation. And so Six Sigma is strong, outsourcing is strong, because chances are somebody else has done it and they have the answer for you. It doesn't make sense for you to build it yourself and sort of reinvent the wheel. And in the middle we have lean, right? So things that are products we can buy off the shelf, or if we are working on one of these capabilities, we're focused on learning and reducing waste. It's that continual improvement kind of idea. And yet lean is more weak in the early stages and a little bit weak in the later stages. So it kind of spans the gap in the middle. So I'd like to represent Taylorism with a Wardley map. Put the users at the top, you have the company and you have the worker, and they have a common need, which is prosperity. In order to fulfill prosperity, we need to have work that's getting done, and we need implements in order to enable that work. So this is the basic value chain, and I've placed these along where I think they are in terms of their evolutionary stage. And what I think Taylor did is basically added the science of the work as a dependency for the work and its implements. And once that science of the work exists, and it's accepted and it's known, then that basically sets the stage for the work and the implements to themselves shift right as well. And so when we think about how characteristics change over time, the implications of this are relatively predictable. When things are shifting towards essential, ubiquitous, defined volume operations and efficiency and so on, essentially costs go down because things are known and efficient. Productivity goes up because more stuff can get done with that volume operations, and also as well because we're enabling prosperity, and the better way that our work is happening now enables greater prosperity because we can sell more. Then the wages and dividends for the company and worker go up and prosperity increases. So when I think about Taylorism and scientific management, I would place it probably in the stage 3, stage 4 as being strong, because again, it's focused on reducing deviation. It's about finding the one best way for doing something. So this process of mapping to me is reductionism in action. It's taking the giant ball of mud of our systems, of our companies, and taking it apart into component parts so that we can talk about localized action, right? So the science of the work, for instance, is a localized part. It's a component of this value chain. And when it didn't exist, it started out in novel concept. It started out in stage 1. And over time, we might apply Agile methods, build that in-house, and over time that might shift to the right towards the best and accepted, stage 4. And that means that we're going to treat it differently. So instead of focusing on Agile methods, trying to figure out what a science of work even is, we're going to focus on Six Sigma-ish more Taylorism style things where we're focused on reducing deviation and making things standard and known. So, reflecting on this slide, so I think Agile is a disease if and only if it's unscoped, a switch flip, and it's inauthentic. But let's think about the opposites of each of these. If it's scoped, if it's contextualized, if we've taken a look at our system and we've broken it down into its parts and we know that Agile is appropriate for these parts and not so appropriate for these other parts, then it's no longer a disease, it's actually generative. And if it's not a switch flip, if it's actually a transition that's thoughtful, as we saw with both implementing lean and implementing scientific management, it takes time to get through these sorts of things, to really one by one person at a time, help change the mindset and get people working into a situation that is more generative and more helpful. And authentic agility is studying the principles and then applying them in a way that's adaptive. It's translating them for the local context instead of just adopting practices that may or may not work for you. Like the Spotify model may not be the right model for you, right? So what parts of that translation are appropriate for you? What parts aren't appropriate for you? And in general, are the Agile principles coherent with your version of agility? So in conclusion, here's my letdown, right? So try stuff. Use and adapt what works. Stop using and doing what doesn't work, right? And methodologies don't have feelings, but people do. So treat them as such.